thank the organizers of this forum for inviting me, Peking University, the Beijing Municipal Commission of Education, and the Korea Foundation for Advanced Studies. It's the Korea Foundation for Advanced Studies that I've had the privilege to work with closely during the past year, and hence that's why I'm here today. It's also an honor to participate in this forum and on this particular panel. Personally, for me, it's a pleasure to visit Beijing after a 2-year break or a 2-year hiatus. For 2 decades before that, I worked for Moody's Investor Service, both in New York City and in Singapore. And I had many visits to Beijing and to China, meeting economic and finance officials at the central government level, as well as at the provincial level. I have fond memories of those visits and learned much from them. Today, I actually will focus on the Belt Road Initiative. I understand that's the subtitle of the conference, of this panel rather. And I will focus on global economic governance, that aspect of this panel, from the practical, on-the-ground level in regard to economic development in general and infrastructure investment in particular. But before I turn to that, I can't resist, and I would like to step back and make a high-altitude observation about why I think we are discussing this topic here in Beijing this weekend. And actually, the inspiration for this, I also teach at Columbia University as an adjunct professor. And in my class, we were, last Tuesday, we were talking about geopolitical risk and how that affects sovereign credit risk. And so what we were talking about is this concept of the end of history, and how indeed history has not ended, and that the major powers, both the status quo and newly emerging powers, are seeking to maintain and advance world order and global governance, but are struggling now to find a common path. We see this not only in infrastructure investment in Asia, but also in global trade, liberalization, nuclear non-proliferation, human rights, the rule of law, and climate change. In a foreign affairs article written in 2014 titled The Return of Geopolitics, Walter Russell Mead reminded us that of the political scientist Francis Fukuyama's famous end of history's formulation. With the end of the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States, nation states in the future would have to adopt the principles of Western, especially American, liberal capitalism to keep up. But we see now that with the global damage wrought by the transatlantic financial crisis in 2008, and with the United States stepping back from its preeminent post-World War II leadership role in global trade and finance, that competing ways of advancing world order and global governance are emerging, namely from China. I understand that in yesterday's keynote, a couple of yesterday's keynote speakers referred to 19th century philosophers, Marx and Adam Smith. Well, I would like to refer to another one in relation to the return of geopolitics and Francis Fukuyama, the end of history formulation. Actually, the idea that the end of history, this concept of the end of history, was first expressed by a German philosopher, George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, at the beginning of the 19th century. For Hegel, it was the Battle of Jena in 1806 that rang the curtain down on the war of ideas. In Hegel's eyes, Napoleon Bonaparte's utter destruction of the Prussian army represented the triumph of the French Revolution over the best army that pre-revolutionary Europe could produce. This spelled an end of history, Hegel argued, because in the future, only states that adopted the principles and techniques of revolutionary France would be able to compete and survive. Well, history has not ended, and the competition for global leadership continues. However, the overall title of this session, New Dynamics of Economic Development in a Changing World, this idea of new dynamics and a changing world, I think at the fundamental level I see more continuity, at least in the challenges that exist and how we should deal with those challenges. So, with these lofty thoughts, I would now like to turn to discuss in a more practical terms the topic conveyed by the subtitle of this session, the Belt Road Initiative and Global Economic Governance. The Belt Road Initiative. The Belt Road Initiative has taken essential and significant place in China's economic development vision and foreign policy. Although the word strategy is not in the title, BRI does have strategic aspects and consequences. My understanding of the BRI vision is that it reflects China's pluralist rather than liberal approach to the future of the international order. The new Silk Road spirit seeks to make value-indifferent trade, not politics, drive interconnectedness, and advance civilization. This differentiation means that the BRI is not China's Marshall Plan for Eurasia, as America's Marshall Plan for Western Europe and its reconstruction from World War II was. The BRI lacks the linkage of the Marshall Plan's policy prescriptions with external financing. However, I think for the BRI to be successful, some policy conditionality is necessary, namely an improved governance at the operational level, as this will be critical, as critical as the extension of infrastructure financing for positive outcomes in this region in the future. I'll turn to benefits from China. So why is China doing this if it's not value-driven? Well, there are benefits for China, and these derive from the large infrastructure investment needs in the region. According to the Asia Development Bank's baseline estimates, 45 of the 68 of the BRI member countries will need to have invested $23 trillion in the period 2016 to 2030. That's approximately 1.5 trillion annually. And meeting that demand, a growing share is coming from China's outbound investment. China's total stock of outbound direct investment to BRI countries was 116 billion at the end of 2015, representing 11% of China's total ODI stock. Another point is that China obtained 126 billion of new infrastructure contracts from BRI countries in 2016, representing about 52% of China's total engineer, procure, and construct EPC contracts globally. So that's a huge number for China, a significant number. And the top 10 BRI countries, which include Pakistan, Indonesia, and Malaysia, accounted for more than half of the value of Chinese infrastructure projects in BRI countries in 2015. So the investment will be focused on the high absorption, high growth economies in this Eurasia region. And one example of this is the Jakarta to Bandung high-speed rail project, which I think was initiated in January 2016. This is a $5 billion project operated by a subsidiary of China Railway Group, and its chief provider of funds is the China Development Bank. Nevertheless, despite this recent pickup in investment from China into the BRI region, direct investment from China to BRI countries accounts for only a very small share of total investment in this region, about 2%, considerably below that from Europe, which is 51%, and the US, 11% as of 2015. However, as I said before, China's influence on the margin with new lending is becoming increasingly important, particularly in critical countries in this region, in the BRI Eurasia region, particularly those countries that are lesser developed countries. So that's one benefit, investment from China that will I think, boost China's economic development. Another benefit for China is overcapacity reduction. China's increasing exports of machinery and transportation equipment to the BRI countries offers an outlet for overcapacity in these sectors. This is something the Chinese government has been struggling with for many years now. And then another benefit I see, the third benefit, is the potential to expand the internationalization of the renminbi. However, there's a lot that has to be done here. This is really just the potential. As for the use of the renminbi in transactions within this BRI zone, represents only 14% of total cross-border trading settlements since 2015, which still lags the average for all cross-border trading settlements of 23%, according to the People's Bank of China. However, China is seeking other ways to expand the importance of the RMB, and one of these is through bilateral local currency swaps, and 24 of the 36 bilateral currency swaps that China has are with BRI countries. Now, some of them are the advanced countries, such as Korea, but still, this loose construct of the BRI zone, it does provide a boost to the internationalization of the renminbi. Now, where will this funding come from that's funding exports and investment in the BRI countries? This is largely coming from the policy banks, at least from China's sources, the domestic policy banks, such as the Export-Import Bank of China, the China Development Bank, and the China Export and Credit Insurance Corporation, which have provided about $750 billion in funding. Second to that are the banks and both the commercial banks and the multilateral development banks. And of the multilateral development banks, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank accounts for about $100 billion in financing. The Silk Road Fund, the New Development Bank, total more than $100 billion. And then the Asia Development Bank outside of China and the World Bank have also kicked in close to $100 billion in lending to China. That's part of this BRI lending. Now, what are the risks to China? Well, one of the risks to anyone lending in this area, particularly and really I'm talking about the less developed area of the BRI countries, and about 2/3 of the countries are, I would say, are less developed economies. And so there's little transparency on the return of capital, so going into an investment, you're really not sure what your return would be on that investment. And the repayment risk as well, so there's uncertainty over the level of your return, and then there's uncertainty over getting any return. Most BRI countries have relatively weak credit profiles, indicating high repayment risk, weak institutions, and poor governance. Almost 2/3 of the 68 BRI countries are either rated below investment grade or not rated by Moody's. And of the investment flows that have actually gone in to the BRI countries, more than 1/3 go into these high-risk, lower-rated countries. Excluding Singapore, about 54% of China's total investment has gone into the BRI, has gone into risky BRI countries. Recognizing that this is a risk, China's National Development and Reform Commission announced recently that it would strengthen regulation to reduce risks for domestic firms investing overseas and prevent irrational investment in the Belt and Road Initiative. The BRI effect, the next topic I'd like to turn to is the BRI effects on strengthening institutions and governance within the BRI countries. I think this would most effectively come through policy-based lending, namely from the international financial institutions, such as the status quo Bretton Woods institutions, the ADB, World Bank, and IMF, but also from the the newer IFIs were not exactly part of the Bretton Woods, and that most prominently means that the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank potentially has a big role to play to supplement investment in the BRI area. Historically, so why do I focus on where the BRI infrastructure investment seems to be transactional and not policy-based? Because if you look back at history, it's the policy-based lending that has helped to catalyze economic growth in developed sound institutions, I think, more than commercial type lending. And absent other factors that are intrinsic to the nation itself, that's the recipient of the aid. And we see this in the U.S. government's Marshall Plan for reconstruction of post-World War II Europe. And remember, the BRI is not intentionally not a Marshall Plan. The funds provided by the U.S. government in the Marshall Plan were modest, only $13 billion. But it was the policy conditionality that steered Western Europe away from tendencies to become a centrally planned socialist system to a free market capitalist system. The beneficial outcome in terms of high living standards and per capita income levels in Western Europe today validates linking economic policies to investment projects. Another positive example of this normative policy-based lending is right here in China, where development bank lending helped Deng Xiaoping reforms gain traction in the 1980s and 1990s. China's reform process was facilitated by a proactive relationship with multilateral agencies, including the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund. Both institutions provided unique opportunities for China to learn from the experience of other countries in a professional and politically neutral international setting. The Dalian Conference in June 1993 was a pivotal event and building block in the evolution of China-World Bank relationships. The conference marked a turning point in the national debate on two major issues, the appropriate degree of economic centralization for China, and two, the management of aggregate demand in China's semi-reformed economy. Through consultations and technical assistance projects, the World Bank became substantially involved in redesigning China's institutional framework for macroeconomic policy and control. And the Dalian Conference was a breakthrough in this process. This took place in June 1993, as I said, and as you all know, later in 1993, the third plenum of the 14th Party Congress adopted a comprehensive package of economic reform, which set the new stage for decisive breakthrough in China's market reforms. And as the third plenum said itself, it created China's socialist market economy. And in concluding, the former World Bank China representative in Beijing in the 1990s, Peter Baudelaire, who later became a professor at Johns Hopkins University, noted that the Dalian Conference was an important building block in the process that led to China's economic modernization. And I think China's example demonstrates that reform is not possible without a commitment by a country's leadership and bureaucracy to reform, and that an outside agent can help catalyze reform. And so the lesson to apply to the Belt Road Initiative is that institutional development must be combined with infrastructure investment to achieve sustainable development. The next topic I'd like to discuss is, will the BRI be transformational in regard to institution building and governance strengthening in the Eurasia area? Well, I think the challenges and obstacles here are formidable. And there is a correlation between sustained economic growth and high per capita income with good governance. Most countries in the post-World War II era have either gotten stuck in the middle income trap or in the low income trap. This is a conclusion made by the Nobel laureate economist Michael Spence, who counts only a handful of less developed countries as having broken through the middle income trap, let alone the low income trap. They tend to be in East Asia, such as Korea, economies that broke through this trap, and the economies are Korea, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Singapore, namely, and outside of Asia, Chile is one of them, but these are just a small number. What you need is inclusive growth that he concludes, and this is really impossible without good governance. And good inclusive growth rather than extractive growth, which provides an environment in which countries get stuck in these traps. The extractive growth environment is one that's characterized by corruption, the weak rule of law, in other words, very weak institutions and poor governance. If I could turn to the one slide I managed to do. And I'll focus in on one aspect of governance. The World Bank publishes global governance indicators. It's been doing this for more than a decade now. And the one governance indicator I'll cite to show the challenges that are facing the BRI area is control of corruption. And the other indicators that the World Bank talks about tracks are government effectiveness, namely the effectiveness of the fiscal authorities to formulate a budget, implement it, transparency in the system, quality of the bureaucracy. They also talk about the other indicators of governance are regulatory quality, the rule of law, political voice, and accountability. Those are the other major governance areas, but I'll just focus for this talk on the control of corruption. So what you see here is that the high-income OECD countries, and this would include a few countries outside of Western Europe, have very close to 100% scale of a control of corruption, so the corruption is low. Benchmarking China, China's about half of that. That's probably why Xi Jinping is so focused on his anti-corruption campaign, where he sees for China to be a high-income country that corruption certainly has to be greatly curtailed in the system. The low-income countries are that second bar, and that's the average of every low-income country globally. But turning to specific countries that are in the BRI zone, and I think China plays an increasingly important role on the margin in providing infrastructure finance. These countries include Cambodia, which is very low control of corruption, Kazakhstan, somewhat better, Kyrgyz Republic, down towards Cambodia's level, Myanmar, Pakistan, where there's a huge Chinese investment in Pakistan in the Economic Corridor Project. Sri Lanka also has large investments, and a problem I'll talk about soon to conclude. Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, the Stans have very weak governance. Again, posing problems to the sustainability of infrastructure investment in these countries. So, focusing on governance, I'd like to talk about, bring up two cautionary cases about the need to improve governance and lending to governments along the Belt and Road. And this need really is incumbent on the local authorities and the local governments themselves to improve. One is Bangladesh, the implementation of the Padma Bridge project. Now this project is to link the country's two important seaports. This came to a halt in 2011 when the World Bank, the principal creditor of the government centerpiece infrastructure project, suspended its funding over allegations of corrupt bidding involving a Canadian engineering firm. The bridge project has since resumed in 2015. However, the Bangladeshi government itself has had to fund this. But the implementation delay had adverse economic consequences. The implementation delay and the reputation risks also trimmed financial inflows from international creditors. And so it delayed a project for many years, a project that the Asian Development Bank estimated would provide a significant boost to Bangladesh's GDP. The second project I wanted to talk about is the Colombo Port City project in Sri Lanka. This project became entangled in the country's presidential election in 2015. After defeating a long-serving president, the new president of Sri Lanka suspended the port project upon taking office over allegations of corruption involving local officials and Chinese entities during the bidding process and failures of the previous government to obtain the necessary permits. Although the new president lifted the suspension later that year, the project remains politically controversial. Moreover, Sri Lanka's accelerated drive to expand its infrastructure through external debt financing was not managed prudently and has strained the country's fiscal resources and also jeopardized timely repayment to creditors. In conclusion, I would like to say that the BRI will, at least initially, boost investment and growth in these less developed countries where infrastructure needs are greatest. However, without parallel institutional development and governance reforms within the countries, such gains in growth will most likely prove unsustainable or elusive, particularly in Central Asia. At best, the less developed economies in Eurasia will muddle through rather than break through to higher income levels. I think that the greatest catalytic agent of deep institutional reforms might come from the multilateral international financial institutions, not just the Bretton Woods institutions, including its outpost in Asia, the Asia Development Bank, but also the new multilateral bank established in Beijing, the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, whose commitment to stellar internal corporate governance and also its AAA rating by Moody's Investor Service provides a model and a discipline, as reflected by that rating rather. The AIIB's internal corporate governance provides a model and a discipline to borrowing member countries part of the BRI and the decades ahead. Perhaps the AIIB can also serve as a building block to deepen reform in low-income BRI countries, as the World Bank once did for China's development in the 1990s. Thank you.